I put in mind a remark that's at least attributed to Congressman Udall at the end of a very long debate in Congress. He stood up and he said, well, at this point, everything's been said, but not everyone has said it. So a lot of what you will hear is going to hopefully recapitulate some of the more thoughtful observations today. I come from bringing three perspectives on this, which at least have some relevance to our discussion. As was said, I had the pleasure and honor of working with Jim during the days of developing Goldwater Nichols back on the Senate Armed Services Committee in the 1980s, and then had the opportunity to live with it during my years at the State Department and the White House. And then finally, now in the university, actually teaching about this, spending some time reflecting on both our own experience and the experience of our predecessors and successors. And I think what's significant, and I think one of the big takeaways from today's discussion is that, one, there's clearly a broad consensus about the importance of this issue and the consequentialness of what we've been discussing and the need to make this work better. Second, this is clearly rather unique in light of this discussion that we just had. This is not a partisan or ideological issue. Despite the deep differences that we have on policy and strategy, I think none of we practitioners or scholars or analysts have any doubt, depending on, irrespective of where we sit in the substantive debates, about the need to do something about this, because we recognize that whatever your perspective, your global perspective, your basic ideas about what the priority strategy is, making the system work better to achieve those strategic goals is critically important and therefore needs to be addressed. And I think General Scowcroft said it off in the right tone in identifying the fact that it is the strategic environment that makes this so imperative. I have my own list of reasons why that overlap to some degree with Brent's. First of all, we clearly live in an environment where the lines between domestic and international are blurred and non-existent. And so much of our structures, and both in the legal framework and the operational framework and in the structures, are based on this artificial and significantly outmoded distinction between domestic and international. We see this on issues of health, we see this on issues of homeland security, we see this on issues of the economy, on technology and the like. And we simply have to seriously embrace the fact of interdependence and globalization and recognize that it so dominates every policy issue we have that we have to have processes and structures that reflect it. Second, and again a point that Brett made, because we have multiple overlapping and sometimes conflicting priorities and challenges facing the government, no one structure is going to be ideally situated to deal with all of these different problems. And we have to develop new strategies to deal with the fact that we are dealing with these rather diverse sets of policy challenges. Third, we clearly need to do a better job of integrating all the tools of policy. That we have largely built a structure in which each of the institutions wields one of the tools. And yet, one of the things we recognize is that we're only effective is if we can integrate the way the tools are done. Military, diplomatic, political, economic, social, cultural, and the like. Fourth, and I think it's a very important point that has been touched on by a number of the speakers, particularly in the middle panels, is that I think there's a growing recognition that implementation is every bit as important as policy. And that so much of our structures are built around policy formulation, and I agree with whoever was doing the grading, who gives us a better job on policy formulation and implementation. But what we recognized is that it doesn't matter how good the policy formulation is if the implementation is lousy. And so a greater focus on implementation leads us to a new approach to some of these challenges. And finally, another point that's been touched on by several of the speakers is that there's an increasing importance of non-governmental actors and the need to both bring them into the process, bring them to the table, and not just as actors, but sources of information as well as agents of action. And all of these taken together, I think, are a pretty compelling case for why we need to do things differently. So you ask, well, if we all agree, why is this so hard? And the answer is, I think, pretty obvious, which is that there are a lot of institutional equities, there are a lot of rice bowls that are at risk of being broken here. And I think the important point that was just made in the last panel about time horizons is quite significant. I can say from my own experience that when I came to the State Department in 1993, and there was a great debate about the need to deal with the problem of the relationship between the assistance programs, AID, and the State Department, and this was first presented to Secretary Christopher. He said, you know, I'm only going to be here for 4 or 6 years, and this is a problem that's going to take decades to solve. Let's focus on something we can do now, like make peace in the Middle East. So. goes to show you how hard reorganization really is and how unsuccessful we are. The experience of Goldwater-Nichols, which has informed a lot of our discussion, I think is both hopeful and cautionary to the enterprise that we're about. The hopeful side is that change really does happen. It is possible to make things different. I don't think anybody who's been in this business can look back at what we have now compared to what existed prior to the enactment of Goldwater-Nichols and say that the way in which the military operates has not significantly changed. So that's good. But it did engender considerable resistance, and change didn't happen overnight. As many of you who've been involved in this will recognize that it took rounds and rounds of re-emphasizing, revisiting Goldwater-Nichols through the 80s and 90s to really get to the point where this became ingrained and institutionalized in the culture. So even if we begin to get the blueprints right in the near term, we won't harvest necessarily the positive results in the long term. I also want to point out one other feature of Goldwater-Nichols, which hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves, even though it has. We've had a lot of talk about the interrelation between strategy and process here. One of the efforts of Goldwater-Nichols was the requirement of a national security strategy report. And it was clearly, I think Jim would identify this as something that the Congress took very seriously. That it understood that part of what we were doing with that act was not simply getting the boxes right or even getting the incentives for careers right, but also trying to get a focus on the integration strategy. And as somebody who worked on 6 national security strategy reports, both at the State Department and the White House, we haven't got that part right either. And there are good reasons for that, because it is a hard problem of integrating substance and process. The other thing in terms of thinking about the time horizons is that we have to be cautious about thinking what can be done through legislation and what has to sort of correspond with the realities of day-to-day life. And I want to come back to that at the end of my observations here. I also think it's important to recognize, and I know the people who are doing both the case studies and the history are focused on, is that some innovation has taken place. And it's not as if the situation is static. It's true that the 47 Act hasn't been amended much, but there have been a lot of changes. For example, there is a much closer integration of economic policy and national security policy. During the Clinton administration, we created the National Economic Council, but on a regular basis, we met as deputies, at least, in joint sessions, jointly chaired by myself and the Deputy National Economic Advisor, to deal with many of the problems that involve both economic and national security dimensions. And there was a further innovation in the current administration, in which there was actually a Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economic Affairs created. So there's been a recognition about the need to bring those things together. The creation of the Homeland Security Council was a profound recognition about the need to transcend the boundaries between domestic and international. We can debate whether, in the long run, having a separate HSC makes sense. My instinct is that it doesn't, but in any event, I think it was an important innovation to begin to break down those barriers. And similarly with the Intelligence Reform Act and bringing the FBI into the same room, at least, if not fully successfully integrated into the process, I would recognize that in dealing with intelligence and counterterrorism, we have to have all the actors together, similarly with the National Counterterrorism Center. So, bit by bit, some of the basic insights that we've been talking about today are beginning to be embraced. But I think the important lesson of today is that it is a good time, and perhaps a very propitious time, to sort of begin to sort of look at what we've done bit by bit, and think about whether we're going to get there in incremental steps, or whether there is a more comprehensive look that needs to be done. And I think clearly what we've shown today is that we're not there, and nobody should be satisfied with the changes that have taken place thus far. So today we're supposed to be focusing on what the questions is rather than the answers, and that makes it easier for those of us who are speaking today. But I want to at least just conclude with some thoughts about some of the parameters of the answers that we need to grapple with as this project goes forward. I think one of the things that we've heard, but I want to emphasize it perhaps even more starkly than in discussions, is that the fundamental choice between enhancing flexibility versus trying to create new structures that embody a very particular concept of operations. There are advantages to having to hardwire, as it were, new strategies. If you've got an institution which is devoted to a particular mission and is organized around it, it's far more likely that it's going to be executed. And so you can understand why in the aftermath of 9/11 there was a lot of agitation for a Department of Homeland Security. After all, it's a department, there were going to be people who had that job, and that's what they were going to focus on. Whereas if Homeland Security was simply what it was in the first weeks after 9/11, an interagency effort, there's some concern that people would have multiple objectives and multiple missions, and therefore it wouldn't get the attention that it deserves. But the flip side of it, of course, is that once you turn it into bricks and mortars, you create a lot of rigidity, you make it harder to adapt over time. And I do think that one of the big challenges for this group going forward is how much we really want to make bricks and mortars and boxology changes, and how much we want to simply focus on the question of how do we work better horizontally, as our business colleagues said, and focus less on the boxes and more on the processes. The record of creating new organizations to deal with urgent national policies is not, in my judgment, terribly impressive. If you look at the last two major efforts, the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Energy, which I think were entitled after, what now, 30 years, to begin to make a judgment about how successful it's been in terms of developing a national energy policy, it suggests to me that there's not an obvious link between choosing to build a new institution and solving the policy problem that drove you to want to have the institution in the first place. And I think, again, I think the business panel was right on in talking about, given the incredibly short life cycles of problems that we have to address, the odds that we'll get it right in new box drawing, we won't be either over-inclusive or under-inclusive or misdirected, I think are quite serious. Closely associated with that, and I think there's been a good emphasis today, is how much do we want to focus on changing mindsets and cultures as opposed to changing institutions and processes. And I think that there is a powerful lesson, and it is demonstrated both in the public and private sector, that at the end of the day, you can help if you've got good processes, but if the mindsets aren't there, if the basic belief in the way of doing business isn't there, then it's going to be difficult. And I think one of the things that we can be optimistic about over time is that those of you here and those of the who follow us who are younger than my generation are much more used to working in a more networked and horizontal fashion than a lot of my generation, our predecessors, and are more used to the idea of flexible creations and rapidly changing networks and teams. And I think that model and mindset can be very helpful as we think about devising strategies going forward. The whole model of the internet, of viral networks and the like, really is I think, much better adapted to the kinds of challenges that we're talking about than 19th and mid-20th century models of management. As I said, it has particular significance because one of the strategic facts of our life is the importance of the non-governmental sectors, the NGOs, the business sector, and sources of information, knowledge, and expertise that are outside of government. And if we're going to find ways to work with that, there's nothing that the boxes will do to solve that problem. It really is a mindset of understanding that you don't look at it from just a civil service chart, but rather who's got the knowledge, who's got the information, who's got the ability to make things happen. And I think that will lead to a lot more creativity going forward. And I think that the other thing that we have learned is that we do need to have this be a collaboration between the Congress and the executive branch. And I think that there are two dimensions to that, which is one, I do not believe that this can work if Congress tries too rigidly to define the parameters of the process going forward. I think it's the nature of legislation that makes it hard to try to specify with any effectiveness how to make operations and processes work like this. I think Congress rightly should set the tone and the direction that it wants to go, but I think it's almost inconceivable, both because of the nature of our government and the nature of the problems, to be able to be very directive. And I think it's instructive to think about the 1947 Act and go back and read it, and how little directive it was. I mean, it set a tone, and it certainly did create some new departments. But it also has not been a sort of a kind of a micromanaging tool of administration And it has, I think, served us well to try to adapt the processes over time. Even if they haven't worked perfectly, there's been tremendous room for an opportunity to maneuver within the 47 Act. I also think that, although there's been some discussion today about the danger of reinventing the wheel, that actually, if you look at least over the last 3 administrations, that the basic processes that were adopted by the Bush administration, Bush 41 administration, actually have been the processes that have governed much of the interagency process. There have been innovations. We tried to do it in the Clinton administration with some of the problems of complex emergencies, and there have been some innovations in the Bush administration. But the core structure has actually had a lot of stability over time, and I think that that's a positive lesson in its own right, that there are certain enduring features about what does work. And the corollary to that, of course, and there's been a great deal of discussion today, is about the role of personalities and leadership. At the end of the day, the president is going to have a process that works for him and her. And it's not going to matter what's in the legislation, and it's not going to matter what's in the PDD. And for those of you who are students of this and read the history, every president has set up a set of informal mechanisms to parallel the formal mechanisms. And it's not simply because the formal mechanisms didn't work, but there are also certain benefits from informality that are just uncapturable, no matter how good the formal system is. And so we should expect that, and we need to have a tolerance for that, both because circumstances will arise that don't fit the expectations going into the development of the process, but also because personalities do matter, and there's simply no way to eliminate that from the way in which the president and his or her core team are going to work together. Another reason to be skeptical about trying to overprescribe how we go forward is that the reality is that even if we're successful in this effort, and we do make some changes going forward, we have to remember, as so many of our speakers today have reminded us, that we're not trying to solve yesterday's problems, and we're not really even trying to solve today's problems. We're trying to solve tomorrow's problems, but we don't know what they are. And so if we haven't created a structure that's going to be able to accommodate the next big problem, and not when it's not terrorism, and maybe it's not even China, but something else we haven't yet even brought to our own imagination for the next generation, then we are just setting ourselves up for a replication of what we've been doing and the problems we've been addressing here today. For me, then, the bottom line is, I think, 3 words that ought to guide us as we think about solutions going forward. First is flexibility, both in the nature of the strategic environment and the need to be prepared for the unforeseen. Creating flexibility and to break down barriers is probably the single greatest opportunity and challenge that we face. And that if we can do one thing, and I think I took this especially away from our discussion on the legal work, is if we can get some of the barriers broken down, it's less important what we put in its place, and maybe even important not to put too much in its place to succeed. The second word is authority. And I think that, from my own experience, that probably is the single greatest challenge that we face. And one of the reasons we are so unable to execute the way we want to is that we do not have authority in place to command the resources, the people, and all the tools at our disposal to execute any kind of sustained policy. And the third word is accountability, because if you're going to have flexibility, and if you're going to give future presidents and their teams the opportunity to devise structures and create the ability to adapt, you also have to have accountability. And I think that's something that Congress is entitled to, that the American people are entitled to. And it goes to this very powerful point that so many have made, which is that what we're talking about is achieving objectives and performance. And that's what we ought to be judged by, and we ought to give the tools to the president and his team or her team to be able to achieve them, but then hold them responsible for not, if they aren't able to achieve them. And I think that's a legitimate balance between creating the freedom to make this happen and also to make sure that it's not abused. And we've obviously had some concern. We talked about the experience of the Reagan administration, concerns about abuse, but I agree with whoever it was said that we may be overly concerned about the danger of abuse and hamstringing ourselves from the ability to achieve excellence. I am quite convinced that we can do better in terms of making our processes work better, particularly to create the flexibility and adaptability to to deal with these new challenges. But I also feel very strongly, as many have said, that it will take leadership. It will take leadership not only in the executive branch but in Congress to put this to work and to really give future presidents the tools that they need to meet these very difficult challenges. So I commend everybody involved in this project. It's a big challenge, and it will be an important challenge not only to come up with these good ideas, but to convince the gentlemen who were just here before that they need to spend the time and attention not only to support changes that are needed to make the executive able to do it, but also to make the changes in Congress to support it. Because at the end of the day, in addition to all of these things that we've talked about, unless the resources are available to do this in a way that can be used to achieve these objectives, we're also not going to be successful. So thank you all. Thanks to Jim and the whole team.